Hi, I'm Professor Matthew Rimmer. I am a Professor of Intellectual Property and Innovation Law at the QT Faculty of Business and Law in Brisbane, Australia. As is normally the custom in Australia, I'd like to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land and waters of which I am based, which is the Turrbal and Yugara peoples. Which I think is kind of particularly important given the significance of Indigenous intellectual property to our particular project. I was the lead editor for the Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals. I was ably assisted by my co-editors Beta Amani and Carolyn Ncube. We had a very kind of particular ambition in terms of putting together the collection. We were keen to kind of cover all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in the collection. We were also intent on cutting across a wide array of different forms of intellectual property. We were also keen for there to be a diverse array of contributors from a wide array of different jurisdictions. And really those objectives were partly a response to some of our concerns with some of the existing literature in relation to intellectual property and development. Some of it was very mono-focused on intellectual property and the Sustainable Development Goal, just looking at innovation. Sometimes the field was very kind of dominated by a select set of topics like access to knowledge, access to medicines and technology transfer. And sometimes some other topics didn't necessarily get the coverage that they were due. There was also a bit of a kind of a transatlantic bias in the publishing. So often there were a lot of papers from the United States on sustainable development. There was kind of quite a significant amount of literature in the European Union on sustainable development. Some of the Nordic countries had a very kind of strong interest in sustainability as well. But we were kind of keen to shift the geographical focus away from those territories in terms of the collection. So the work in many ways was informed by the contributions of the editors. Each editor really took control of a third of the collection in terms of its topics and tried to put together a list of contributors to tackle particular topics. So I was really focused on contributors in the Asia Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. I also tended to have oversight of those papers, really looking at some of the environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Beta Amani was really focused on the Americas and also had a focus on inequality and human rights. Karen Ncube took command of looking at intellectual property and sustainable development in various African nations. And also in some European states as well. And she focused in particular upon some of the sustainable development goals that were kind of focused upon human health and science and technology. But really we worked as a kind of collective team in terms of bringing that together. We held some workshops. And then we went through a number of drafts following on those workshops. And in the end, from 2022 to 2024, finally kind of came up with the final collection, which is over 700 pages and has 30 plus contributors. I was kind of particularly happy that there was a strong focus on South Africa in the collection, much thanks to Carolyn's efforts. When I was an undergraduate student, I kind of visited Cape Town for a debating tournament. I was kind of very interested in legal developments that were happening in South Africa at that time. And then, of course, there was the kind of great controversy over the world's largest pharmaceutical companies suing the South African government over the provision of access to essential medicines from India to try to deal with HIV/AIDS. And there was a kind of a huge public uproar about that action, and in the end, the drugs companies withdrew their action. But I think that moment was a really interesting kind of flashpoint in terms of intellectual property, sustainable development, and access to essential medicines. And has certainly kind of resonated, particularly with the more recent COVID crisis, in which there were lots of concerns about vaccine nationalism, inequalities in terms of the distribution of vaccines and diagnostics and treatments. And kind of concerns about intellectual property kind of being a barrier to access potentially to key technologies. South Africa, I guess, has also been really important in terms of some of the debates over copyright law and access to knowledge. And that has certainly been a particular case in relation to disability rights. So I think one of the most interesting chapters in the collection involves the Australian academic Professor Paul Harper, who is blind, writing about the South African dispute over copyright law and disability rights in the courts, and kind of thinking about the larger significance of that action. There's also, I guess, been a really important contribution of South African law to trademark law and debates over freedom of speech. I can remember seeing Albie Sachs kind of talk about the very important Black Label case, in which there was a debate over a kind of a culture jamming of a famous trademark. You know, there are a number of chapters in the collection that kind of have a look over at battles over trademarks and inequality and freedom of speech. So I think that precedent is also quite timely and important. And also I think South Africa has been very kind of innovative in terms of grappling with questions around Indigenous intellectual property, which is, I guess, pertinent for many other jurisdictions. In Australia, we've long been having kind of parallel debates about the need for sui generis recognition of Indigenous intellectual property. With the new Albanese government, it looks like we might finally have some bills trying to achieve that. But, you know, in many respects, South Africa was in a much more advanced state than Australia in terms of its law reform campaigns. So I would commend the collection to you all. I'd like to thank the editor, Caroline, and her set of contributors in particular for their rich, diverse intellectual inquiries into the Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think provides a blueprint for further law reform in this field. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best with your webinar today.